If nothing else, the last few weeks of the US presidential campaign has been full of twists and turns. One week, Trump narrowly avoids death, and as a result seems resurgent to the point of unbeatability. The very next week, Biden is out, Kamala Harris is in, and there's been a big momentum shift. And during the previous week, that momentum shift kept on going. And the thing is, I don't think it was just an extension of the Kamala honeymoon period. I mean, partly, but there's some campaign tactics and there's some mistakes all mixed in there together, some of which could be minor and temporary, but at least one move by Trump that could echo through his 4-year term in office, should he win one. So let's canter through all of this. First of all, basic campaign stuff. Why did Trump have a bad week last week and Kamala Harris had an excellent week? One, the Democrats' messaging changed, and almost by accident, they hit on a new attack line that is way more effective than what they were previously doing. Second, Trump did exactly what used to work for him back in 2016, and there's a good chance it's just not working for him anymore. Let's do them in order. What the Democrats were doing via Joe Biden, at least up until the thankfully failed assassination attempt, was to talk up the danger of Trump. He was an existential threat to democracy. This election could be the last democratic election America sees if a result goes Trump's way, and so on and so on. And all of this against a backdrop of lawfare, where various Democrat-associated figures were pursuing Trump through the courts on a number of grounds, most of which seemed rather oddly aligned to the election timetable. I sometimes get people misrepresenting me in the comments on this channel, arguing that the law should go soft on Trump for the sake of avoiding civil war. But that is not my position and never has been. If someone who promised in advance to find something, anything, to nail Trump on, comes up with a case that should have been a misdemeanor case, should have expired according to the statute of limitations, but uses a novel device to turn it into a felony charge in a way that has never been done for anyone else in the history of that state, yeah, that's not about the law going soft on Trump. To most people, that's political persecution. And my point was always that the sight of such abuses led to Trump gaining more support, not less. So it was counterproductive. And so it was with the campaign messaging. He'd already been president once, remember. So if you're asking people to take your word for it, that although that wasn't the end of democracy, next time definitely would be, that rather sounds simply like campaign messaging. Now look, I think there's lots of reasons why you wouldn't want to elect such an obviously self-serving narcissist to be in charge of your country. But Democrats came up with lines that only seemed to cast themselves as political persecutors and Trump as a relatively strong man under attack. There are significant numbers of people who like strong men leaders and go out of their way to excuse their abuses that they simply wouldn't do for their opponents. And no, I don't think that's a great facet of human psychology, but if you're running for election, you should craft your campaign to fit the way people are, not the way you'd wish them to be. Anyway, the assassination attempt was a shock to the system. While they weren't going to agree with any suggestion that their rhetoric had caused the attempt, there's no evidence either way. Nevertheless, Democrats realised they needed to cool things down a bit. Arguably, they should have realised they needed to do that just because what they have been doing all this time wasn't working. But whatever. Then Biden dropped out and Harris took over. In theory, there was no reason why the Harris campaign would need to adopt a different approach at all. It could have inherited the existing campaign playbook and run with it. But whether because of the assassination attempt, or because somebody actually noticed it had been disastrously failing, or because Harris simply had different messages she wanted to promote, they came up with a new approach. It wasn't the result of a long period of time with focus groups, it was rather organic. As Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, on an interview with the Morning Joe talk show, labelled MAGA Republicans generally as, quote, just weird. The thing is, with Trump's extravagant behaviour, most recently going on about Hannibal Lecter for reasons nobody can really fathom, and J.D. Vance's own oddities going on about single cat ladies, the weird label was actually pretty effective. And here's the thing, Trump's extravagant behaviour in the past, including the quite recent past, used to work because it provoked outrage amongst his enemies, meant that everyone was talking about that latest outrage, certain in their mind that if only they talked about it more, it would surely damage him. And of course, it actually had the effect of giving him profile, showing him to be fearless, willing to say anything to anybody. It sucked the oxygen out of the room for his opponents. But it doesn't work if what happens instead is your opponents laugh at you. And the thing is, it's actually taking a leaf from the Trump playbook, but turning it round on him. Vivek Ramaswamy, for instance, fumed on Twitter. Their weird argument from the Democrats is dumb and juvenile. This is a presidential election, not a high school prom queen contest. Which would be a cutting critique if not offered in defence of a man who talks about Sleepy Joe and Crooked Hillary and lying Kamala. And indeed, the guy who immediately went on to question whether Kamala Harris is actually black when being interviewed by the National Association of Black Journalists. That interview was the second half of why it's been such a bad week for Trump. He had accepted the interview, presumably expecting it would be hostile, but knowing that his brash defiance in the face of such hostile questioning had served him extremely well in previous campaigns. By all accounts, he doesn't believe that's how it went this time. His hostility to the interviewers was in line with what we've seen from him before, and then his comment about Kamala Harris's race was the part that got all the attention. Trump's advisor Susie Wiles had been hammering the campaign's official talking points, that Kamala Harris is, in their words, weak, failed and dangerously liberal. But no, Trump, who goes on his own path when under pressure, instead said she happened to turn black. So that was the end of that strategy. In other words, Trump stepped all over his own campaign. Not for the first time, but arguably potentially the most damaging time. When inevitably asked about the attack by Trump, Kamala Harris showed how much has changed since 2016, because in that previous time there would have been outraged lectures about racism and who knows what else. On this occasion, Harris just said two things. One, that it was simply, quote, the same old show that we'd seen so often before. And secondly, he wants to take us back. I want to move us forward. That was, I have to say, an extremely well-judged response. One, the same old show is treating your opponent as not to be taken that seriously. It has the echo of Ronald Reagan's pivotal debate comment when he was facing Jimmy Carter. There you go again. And secondly, that line about taking us back rather than moving us forward. Unusable, arguably, when the candidate was Biden, but now, bearing in mind a lot of Americans in the middle had been saying they wanted a different choice to Biden versus Trump, it helps to underline that, yes, half of that equation has now changed. So there is no doubt that whereas Trump was winning the campaign 2 weeks ago, he has been losing the campaign ever since. That's reflected by the fact that 2 weeks ago he was ahead in all the swing states, and now that lead has been wiped out in many and cut to within the margin for error for the rest. Does that mean he can't win the election? Certainly not. Pollster Nate Silver still gives him significantly higher probability of taking the Electoral College. But there are still 4 months to go in this campaign. The momentum through those 4 months is going to be key in deciding the outcome of such a close race. If you're pro-Trump, you have to hope that he can get over his reported emotional crisis over suddenly finding that, whoops, he has a real opponent to face, and therefore has to get back to following an actual campaign strategy, having some discipline. If you're pro-Harris, you're hoping she can keep her momentum even once the honeymoon period is decisively over, which logically it must be very soon. The interesting, more substantive thing to note is just how much Trump's flailing is now damaging a GOP coalition that seemed incredibly solid just a couple of weeks ago. For one thing, as Trump's pick for vice president has been attacked, Trump has given him somewhat less than wholehearted support. When asked about the attacks on J.D. Vance, Trump said, well, the vice president position isn't really that important anyway. That will be news to Mike Pence, given that he was threatened with a public hanging, if you recall, for not exercising his duties in the way Trump believed to be possible. In any case, you wouldn't expect that response to make Vance feel especially like a valued member of the team. I predicted just 2 weeks ago that Vance's biggest challenge would be staying in favour all the way through a Trump 4-year term. That seems to have been affirmed in rather faster form than I'd expected. But then there's also Trump's disavowal of the Project 2025 exercise. As you probably know, Project 2025, 900-page policy book designed by the Heritage Foundation to act as a program for the next Trump administration. A lot of people who have been loyally dedicated to such an administration spent a vast amount of their time producing it. Many of those people were Trump people. J.D. Vance himself wrote the foreword. Democrats had read the thing and it terrified them. This terror had been accentuated by how some of the authors talked about it. It was going to be the battle plan for the next administration. The, quote, Second American Revolution that would be bloodless if the left allows it to be. But some of the attacks against it obviously were being felt by Trump to be landing hard. And since he's not a policy man particularly, he has no special loyalty to anything in the document, he decided to take to social media to completely rubbish it. He claimed to know nothing about it, to have no idea who was behind it. Not only that, he added, quote, some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Within a short period of time, the project's director, Paul Dance, had stepped down. Rather than being a symbol of the new, well-oiled political machine they had wanted Trump's next term to be, it had instead come to reflect the same sort of internal chaos, instability, and disputes that marked a previous one. Just a few days ago, Trump's senior advisors, Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles, released this statement on behalf of the Trump campaign. Reports of Project 2025's demise would be greatly welcomed and should serve as notice to anyone or any group trying to misrepresent their influence with President Trump and his campaign. It will not end well for you. Ouch! The thing is that so publicly savaging your most loyal supporters is a testament to the resurgence of fear that you might not win. It talks about weakness, not strength. Not only that, but he's playing badly, unsurprisingly, with some of those people whose active support you most need to make your campaign effective. Some of them have been vocal. Pat Brady, the former Illinois Republican Party chairman, said this: you can't win an election with just hardcore Trumpy Republicans. You need to get the 11% of Republicans that supported Nikki Haley and her 4% or 5% more moderate Democrats. New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu called on Trump to stop the name-calling. Quote, nobody can tell Donald Trump what to say or what to tweet, but this is all based on one thing: winning. This is about elections, and I want Republicans to win. The thing is, if Trump is rattled by Kamala Harris, is he likely to fall back in line with his own strategists? Pat Brady said that he doubted it. Quote, media attention is Trump's oxygen. If he doesn't get it, he goes crazy, and he does stupid things like he did yesterday. How things have changed. 2 weeks ago, Republicans united behind their strongman candidate who had punched the air in the face of death. Their opponents, however, were calling on their own candidate to step aside, saying that he was too old and too feeble to stand. Now it's Republicans talking dissent in public and Democrats who are putting up the show of unity. My prediction, and I'm not going to pretend this was a hard one, it's probably all going to look quite different again in another 2 weeks. Now, different how? That probably starts with Trump. He showed discipline enough when his opponent's campaign was sinking rapidly under its own flaws. Indeed, I've said here before, he was running by far the most professional campaign he has ever done, and it was working. But not so much now his opponent has the momentum. So this is his test. Harris won't have to do as much if Trump continues on self-inflicted harm. The things that used to shock and scandalise everyone and put him at the centre of everything and worked in building his support, well, now apparently just comes across as, a bit weird.